very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very difficult for me to speak after Sister Ackermann, because my talk will have quite a different format. I won't show you slides, so I offer you only words. And the second thing is, you might think I'm inhibited in psychomotorical terms. This might be true in comparison, but this is due to the fact that I had a bike accident, and this is the first day that I can walk around without an arm-shoulder bandage, so this might play a role as well. Let me first tell you what I'm going to present to you. My talk will have 3 parts. The first one might be the most difficult to swallow. In this first part, I want to make explicit the first part of my title, the recognition of the other, drawing upon some philosophical literature. And the second and the third part are devoted to practical purposes. I want to apply the concept first, the second part, to the clinical area, and then I dare to apply it to political issues. So let me start with the first part. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida affirmed that the word resistance, résistance, remained for him the most beautiful word in politics, and that it is laden with the whole pathos of my nostalgia. Derrida, as you know, has recommended to us a special form of reading, one that does not proceed immediately to a goal, but suspends the meaning, one that, instead of focusing too early on one solution, disseminates ideas which let themselves be carried by language or by the texts, by the seemingly marginal and trivial informations. Derrida was a scholar committed to his own Jewish tradition, which he would not specifically cultivate, but which nevertheless was pertinent for him. Maybe disseminative reading is an expression of Jewish literal culture, and perhaps the Freudian principle of free association shares here a common root. Difference, reworded to différence with the A instead of the E in French, postponement, that is next to dissemination a central concept for Derrida. No one, I think, has taken the notion of difference as serious as him. In line with other philosophical currents of the 20th century, Derrida claims an end to metaphysics, that is, an end to absolute the answering of absolute questions, denying that there is an absolute source or an ultimate goal of our being, our existence, or experience. And he dismisses, and that's important for my concept, the concept of one meaning, the meaning of life, the one and only meaning of a statement or text. So the term origin is replaced by him by the term of architrace, original trace, a purposefully contradictory term. Where there is a beginning, there's already a trace, and any trace refers to something other or different. So it is only après coup, in hindsight, that we state a beginning. All our thinking about origins are assumptions. It's not the original event, but in itself a transcription, what we can only realize retrospectively. So here another common idea refers to Freud. Freud had defined Nachträglichkeit, deferred action, as a theoretical concept that explains the relationship between an event, say a traumatic event, or the consequence. By emphasizing difference, Derrida has also deconstructed the notion of the subject. Due to the precedence of language, the subject is spoken more by the language than that it uses language. Again, it is not possible to cover or attain origins of language when we use it. There always remains a residue, a rest of the unrecognized, which refers in psychoanalysis to the unconscious or to other things that cannot be formulated in our language and nevertheless require translation. So, thinking itself, psychic representation, harbors a difference in itself. So, interpretation is always inconclusive. Without the psychoanalytic experience, this philosophy of difference would not be possible. Without the philosophy of deconstruction, I think it would be difficult to conceptualize the psychoanalytic experience and to link it with social or even political theories. In psychoanalysis, the experience of difference is connected first to the difference between, that's obvious, consciousness and unconsciousness, the experience of the other side of myself. Let me quote a beautiful text by the psychoanalyst and semiologist Julia Kristeva, Stranger to Ourselves. She describes psychoanalysis in its relation to otherness, or as she uses the term, to strangeness, in the following way, quote, with the concept of the Freudian unconscious, the integration of strangeness into the psyche loses its pathological aspect and incorporates an otherness into the interior of the assumed unity of human beings. Moreover, and that's the second point, difference is a feature of interpersonal relationships as well. The interpsychic and the interpersonal perspectives are interrelated. Foreign, I am not only to myself, but foreign to me is the fellow human being. The other becomes the object of my wishes, my desires, and therefore, they will be experienced in a very personalized perspective and, that's the analytical term, for the other, reduced to an object. That is, my desire does not fully grasp the otherness of the other. In psychoanalysis, we examine the desire for the object, and this object relation is critically revised, yet not always resolved. When we reverse this perspective, we come across an idea that is as old as Western philosophy. Desire, according to Plato's myth of Eros, arises from the split in the first two legs, two heads, four-legged, four-armed, united double or twin personality. You know the idea of the Platonic myth. So the desire derives from a difference. There always remains a desire to become whole or double again, to ultimately find the desired object. Contrary to that desire, there will always be a perspective, a characteristic of the other that eludes me, that does not obey my mastery, and immediately will be the source of new desire. Anthropological and abstract, though these thoughts may appear, they have very tangible consequences. Let me quote Julia Kristeva again. Psychoanalysis proves to be a journey into the strangeness of others and of myself, and aims at an ethic of respect for the irreconcilable. How could one tolerate a foreigner if one does not experience oneself as a foreigner? And if we recognize our foreignness, we won't suffer from it nor enjoy it outside. The foreigner is within me, so we are all strangers. And if I'm a stranger, there are no strangers. And she continues, psychoanalysis implies politics. It would be a new form of cosmopolitanism, the working on a humanity whose solidarity is rooting in the consciousness of its unconscious. It introduces us to the difference in its most disarming form and designates it as an indispensable condition for our being with others. Quote end. So the resistance in the therapy is bound to its negative power, if you wish. Instead of demanding positive criteria of identity, it tries to detect and preserve ways of non-identity and to allow modes of difference to present themselves. So psychoanalysis keeps the opportunities often for the other side of myself or the unexpected otherness of the other to show itself. Recognition of the other or the stranger within me and between us, this is a point I'm trying to make, outlines the critical potential of psychoanalysis, but it is a starting point for an analysis for violence as well. Because I am always different to what I pretend to be, because I critically question my consciousness, I do not overvalue my own point of view. That would be one result. Second, because I know that the other has always been an object for me, that my wishes diminishing him or her, I might eventually be able to abstain from violence. Third, to take seriously both the otherness within me and the otherness of the other enables me to let oneself be surprised or to remain curious of all the different aspects that might come up. If I'm counting on these aspects of otherness, I distrust all words or actions that are all too unequivocal. And last and fifth, I change myself by what I conceive of the twofold otherness without ever reaching a seemingly end state of self-transparency. So this was the first part, and it's going to be more easy. That's the clinical applications at first. I thought the ideas I wanted to present to you was that the therapeutic ideas of psychoanalysis are suitable for a critique of violence. Any violence, and that is the thesis implied here, is directed against the other of myself, or is directed against the otherness of the other fellow human being. And very often, both ways, violence against inner alternatives and the violence against the positive strangeness of others go hand in hand. And to stop violence would mean to allow, that's a psychoanalytical term, a potential space, a space in which otherness can be thought of or accepted to evolve. I start with the violence against the other of myself. It's the psychoneuroses which are important here. Experiences or fantasies or thoughts become unconscious if they cannot be accepted as belonging to myself or to my person. Whenever we use repression as a defense mechanism, a part of our personality is banned from consciousness. Repression is a piece of violence that is used against one's own self. Here comes a short example. Mrs. R describes herself as shy. She's afraid of the gaze, die Blicke of others, which had led to an agoraphobia, a phobia to present oneself in open spaces. She's not consciously aware of something obvious, what we can see, the striking black T-shirt, flashing ear and nose rings that give her the look of a dark angel and make her attractive, though morbid and weird at the same time. She obviously cannot accept her own desire to show herself. Now, if the exhibitionistic desire becomes more intensive, she mobilizes defense mechanisms and responds by withdrawal, even by automutilation. So, for instance, cigarette burns on the forearms, the resulting scars making her really not attractive. This violence against her is violence against the other part of herself. But what is the goal of this auto-psychic violence? There are fantasies of violence and aggressiveness which must be warded off. Mrs. R cannot live her exhibitionistic parts because they are experienced by her as too aggressive. Her parents separated when she was 10. She stayed with her father, who yielded to alcohol 2 or 3 years after the mother left him. The daughter lived under the spell that the father, who never again had a partner, at least in what was visible to the daughter, would be lost without her. To live up to her attractiveness in young adulthood meant for the daughter to leave or even kill the father. So the violence directed against her own body is a defense directed against fantasies of emancipation that otherwise would be viewed as violent. So how violence here could be ended is quickly clear. Mrs. R would have to learn to accept the repressed thoughts and expand the range of her unconscious fantasies, get to know herself better and without fear. And she would have to reverse the denial of violence, which may allow fantasies of violence directed against her father to come up. These would be recognized as meaningful and lose their imminent danger. The second aspect, violence against the otherness of the other. Let me turn to the second heteroplastic aspect of violence, the violence that is hostile to others. Psychoanalytic authors have described the narcissistic origin of the intolerance towards others. Narcissistic relationships are dyadic, that means they follow an all or nothing principle. The other is to play a role in one's own psychic economy. His separate or her separate identity is no longer valued or even taken into account. This narcissistic reduction of the other precludes any acceptance that there are sides in the other that are not accessible to anyone. The otherness of the other person can no longer be realized or tolerated. And this inability to transcend one's own perspective generates violence. In clinical terms, we distinguish between different forms of narcissism. The first, the libidinal narcissism, identifies love with partiality. The other is lovable only so far as he or she is in full consensus with me or in full accordance emotionally with myself. The other does not have a right of his own beyond my reach. He is either like me and totally on my side, or inexistent, devalued, or ignored. There's only an either or, an allegiance or a fight, either you or me. Let me give you another clinical example. Mr. F entered day treatment psychotherapy 2 years after he left his long-term partner. He could not overcome the separation and became depressed. In the therapeutic relationship, there is a repetition. As long as the therapists give the patient exactly what he accepts or demands, compassion, care, full confirmation, everything is going well. In the music therapy, the therapist experiences these expectations of the side of the patient as manipulative and prescriptive, and he puts them in question and follows in his medium, the shared musical session, his own way, that is his own, he follows his own tune. Mr. F now begins to regard the music therapist as a personal enemy, and this feeling builds up after the session where he falls into a critical state of mind. He attacks the therapist physically and threatens to proceed legally against him because he should not destroy or humiliate him. And it required a lot of stamina on the side of the music therapist not to let himself be devaluated by the patient and not to give up his emotional contact with the patient, but to maintain his own attitude or even benevolent relationship with the patient. This narcissistic violence can potentiate itself towards a denial of object properties, of personal characteristics of the other in general. The French psychoanalyst André Green has spoken of disobjectalization, and he regards it as a manifestation of the desinstinct in personal relations. This is a second form of narcissism. It's not an either or me, but a sort of radical version of it. And it implies as if the other would say neither you nor I, but instead nothing. So violence then no longer is directed against the other as the other, but it is the only aim left is the abolition of any difference between the self and the other and the dissolution of any desire. This is a perspective in clinical terms where we think of malignant forms of anorexia nervosa, where the patient might be convinced that only by starving to death, by destroying her own body, the objects can be eliminated and distanced in a satisfying manner. Another example for this destructive narcissism would be psychotic retreats, where both the interest in the outside world and the own faculty to think and to be mentally alive may be ultimately sacrificed. What we found out in the, let me briefly return to Mr. F, the patient. What we found out in the development of the therapy was that his difficult and sometimes even paranoid contact to the music therapist brought to light fragments of memories, fragments of a finally reconstructed traumatic scene. He had been sexually abused in childhood by a man from the neighborhood, and this experience was never part of the conscious memory up to this point, but nevertheless was always the basis of his self-image and his life acceptances. The clinically evident result of early trauma is the violence that is implanted to the whole identity, and with the effect that the person who is early on traumatized cannot distance himself or herself from this traumatic incident and has to integrate the traumatic experience into its own identity. So this behavior, like Mr. F's, is not a sign of lack of impulse regulation only. It is a sort of restaging, and the only objectification possible of otherwise invisible violence that colonized the center of his ego. So that's an important point, that it is so important to, as a first step, make the violence that he has experienced visible and reflectable for himself. I have to shorten the paper a bit and come to the third part, to the political applications. From now on, I will focus on the recognition of difference and otherness and its connection to violence in political contexts. Of course, a question immediately arises: what can a psychoanalyst contribute to the topic of political violence? It seems that it can much and far better be understood by sociologists or politicians. The German psychoanalyst Hermann Beland has made remarkable contributions to the psychoanalytic research on violence, and he has, rightly, I think, claimed that psychoanalysts, as experts of the war between two, should ask themselves what they have to say about collective violence. So I apply now the categories I've introduced in clinical terms to political examples. I start with the otherness of my own. To realize that the ego is not the master of in its own house has as a consequence the readiness for self-criticism and self-reflection. It is not compatible with declaring one's position as absolutely valid. To know that I myself can never be completely transparent to myself should lead to admitting that I cannot control anything I provoke in others. To admit failure, indeed, is a rare political ability. The genuflection of Willy Brandt in 1970 has become a symbol for it because he confessed the German failures that, of course, were known at the time but had never been admitted in public. Derrida, whom I quoted in the beginning, has defined infinite justice. You remember that that was the name the US Department of Defense gave to the war against terrorism, infinite justice. He defined infinite justice in sharp contrast to the official version, quote, not to absolve oneself of one's own mistakes, one's own injustice, one's own errors, even at a moment when you will pay the most terrible price for it. The second aspect was the other, taking the other as another person, in dealing with the narcissism that is destructive in therapy. We saw that the first thing for the therapist is to survive as a therapist, not to start a counter-attack against the patient, not to become destructive himself, and not to end therapy, and so on. It is important not to let one's own capacities be destroyed, but to preserve one's own thinking and one's own skills. does this principle apply to politics? Even though the Second Iraq War may have been ethically justifiable, there's a broad discussion on this in the literature. In terms of the international law, it obviously was not. Here, the terrorists' destructive actions has reached its target and destroyed not only buildings and thousands of people, but also fundamental values. Among them is the law of nations as well as the freedom of political discussion. Therefore, it was indeed worrying to detect signs of restriction of human rights in the United States, such as when, during the war in Iraq, the rock band Dixie Chicks, who had written an anti-war song, suddenly had to face repression, or when opponents to the Iraq war were anxious to express themselves publicly. Violence can only be terminated if it does not win. And this is so in therapeutic as well in social circumstances. And the third aspect is recognition of oneself in the other. The narcissistic demonization of the other can be overcome if it is possible to recognize affinities with the other. And this is the prerequisite of empathy. To recognize oneself in others should not lead to a misled tolerance, but to be able to find differently. Let me stay in the United States. After 9/11, Michael Moore has pointed to this aspect with his documentary Fahrenheit 9/11. In the film, he showed a hidden relatedness between the US leaders and the Iraqi leaders. When George W. Bush spoke of crusade, he had already proven by the choice of words to stand in a Western tradition of violence. More concretely, and this is made clear by the film, the US would have been able to recognize themselves in the Taliban because their violence was originally made possible by the US politics. The Taliban were educated in the 80s to wage a guerrilla war against Russia in Afghanistan. Then they were welcome, but they should only fight the Russians, of course. In the film, one can watch Rumsfeld in the late 80s visiting Saddam Hussein on very friendly terms. The film nurtured malice. It would have been more fruitful would the facts have enabled recognition of Iraq as a former ally instead of a member of the axis of evil. Do I have to close? How long? How many minutes? 3, 2? Okay. I skip a linguistic analysis, which is interesting, and there were qualitative research on the speeches on W.H. Bush and Osama bin Laden, and showed the very parallel structure of the way of discussing. And it is as well interesting and part of the paper to compare the inaugurational speeches of W.H. Bush and of President Obama, or for instance his Cairo speech of the 4th of June 2009. And what in this Cairo speech, Obama made it very clear that he does not follow the either or, the Freund, Feind, the friend or enemy dichotomy. And I shortly repeat a part of this Cairo speech. There must be a sustained effort to listen to each other, to learn from each other, to respect one another, and to seek common ground. I am a Christian, as Obama, but my father came from a Kenyan family that includes a generation of Muslims. As a boy, I spent several years in Indonesia, and as a young man, I worked in Chicago communities where many found dignity and peace in their Muslim faith. It was Islam that carried the light of learning through so many centuries, paving the way for Europe's renaissance and enlightenment. So you see, it's a completely different way of comparing or to find, to detect oneself in the other. Let me summarize briefly. The psychoanalysis has its potential as a critical theory in that it leads, in clinical circumstances, to the realization of difference and to a tolerance towards otherness in this double sense. I am an other, I am something else that I intend to be, and the other is really other. And this experience and this acknowledgement of this double difference is applicable to the analysis of not only personal but only political violence. Clinically, we examine these factors that contribute to violence, and we try to initiate a sort of space, a shared space of thinking and talking that allows the otherness to be articulated. We offer a relationship that aims at the recognition of the otherness inside and the otherness of the other fellow human being. And I want to add finally that I think an academia like the Academia Engelberg provides for all of us a similar potential space, a space which allows otherness, different disciplines, to come together and to be articulated and to initiate a thought process. And this, again, is what is needed against violence. Thank you for your long patience.